Hey, welcome back, guys. This is session number 25 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Hey, we're almost halfway there. Hopefully, this course has been both helpful and edifying for you. As we continue chapter number 7, Jesus actually decides that he's going to dig deeper into this idea of washing one's hands, this idea that the Pharisees are so concerned about. But here, Jesus is going to discuss what I call true defilement. What is true defilement? Well, let's go ahead and jump right in to the text and find that out. And he called the people to him again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him, but the things that come out of a person are what defile him." Well, in this passage, we'll see Jesus move from a general explanation to a more specific one. And he starts here with the general explanation for the crowds. A specific explanation is going to come later for his disciples. But he begins here with the crowd and says this. And I want to look at this portion of the text and unpack it a little bit. Remember, Jesus is responding to the Pharisees who have questioned why his disciples ate with what they called unwashed hands. We talked about that in our last session. They seemed really concerned about this. What if these disciples had come in contact with Gentiles? That would have made them unclean, right? And it would have been, according to the Pharisees, catastrophic for their souls, right? But wait, Jesus here in this text, when he says there's nothing outside of a person that by going into him can defile him, he isn't talking about washing hands. He's actually talking about what? Food. Yes, Food. Not the hands that he was just talking about, but food, right? Well, what gives there? What is going on there? No, let's talk about some cultural context here. Now, we know that not all Jewish purity laws were concerned with things going into a person, right? We talked about touching a corpse, right? And defilement was actually contracted by touching one or a person's state of health. There's a lot of lepers in the Bible, in the Old Testament and New Testament, right? So skin diseases actually defile the person. And then there's some bodily emissions that defile a person. All of those can be found in Leviticus 15, right? But all of these things actually rendered a person unclean or defiled. So what gives here? What's going on? Well, Jesus knew that these Pharisees' questions was actually more deeper than washing of hands. It wasn't about the disciples washing their hands. It was about unclean foods, which we'll discover here in just a second. But before we go there, let's talk about what Jesus is talking about. He says that no food from the outside can defile a person, but what goes on inside of him. In other words, he's saying that it's the heart that needs attention and not the diet, right? Look at what Jeremiah 17 says. It says that the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Who can understand it? I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds. That's what he's getting at here. He's talking about a heart matter. It's not all about the diet. It's not all about the food. It's actually about what's going on the inside in your heart, right? And then look at what he says next in Mark 7:17. Side note here, okay? What happened to verse number 16? We just looked at 14 and 15. What happened to 16? Well, that's not a typo, okay? Don't have too much time to go into grammatical context or grammatical analysis, but other versions of scripture actually add verse 16 after the fact. The original manuscripts don't have verse 16, and verse 16 actually says, "He who has ear to hear, let him hear." Now, Jesus says that on other occasions. So there's some folks who were copying the manuscripts who thought that that might be a good place to add it, but it's not in the original. So that's why in your Bible, it may skip from verse 15 to 17. It's not a typo. It's just that people wanted to make sure that we were more close to the original manuscripts than other versions are, right? So here's the thing. The disciples are all kinds of confused here, right? They're like, wait a second. You're saying that we should disobey the law that we've known our entire lives. Like, we know what defiles a person. We know we need to be washing our hands. And you're telling us to disobey that law, the one that tells us what to eat and what not to eat. So they asked him about the parable, right? Because they were very inquisitive. And Jesus turns around and says to them, then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled? Thus he declared all foods clean. Let's look at this first section here. Whatever goes into a person from the outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled. Now, Jesus is talking about the normal biological process here, right? Food goes in and it comes out. He's basically saying, hey, that's temporal. That comes in and goes out. Now, the things that come out of your heart, those things are lasting. And that actually can lead to true defilement. So these Pharisees were actually more worried about the inside of vessels and cups than they were about the true vessels that can be contaminated. And that is people. Right? In their hearts. That's what they should have been worried about. People being contaminated in their hearts. And then Mark adds this little parenthetical here. Thus he declared all foods clean. Now, when you see these things, that means that the author kind of adds an explanation. They would do this from time to time, New Testament authors, right? And Mark does it here because they want to be able to address the audience personally and say, hey, this is what Jesus is doing here. Listen up, right? So around the time that Mark is writing this, the early church is wrestling with the question of what's clean and what's unclean, right? We see that in the book of Acts, right? Where your boy, Peter, we talked about him, having a dream, and Jesus or God tells him to actually rise up and eat food that he considered unclean. He said, no, by no means, I will not do it. And ultimately, he understands that what God has cleaned, what God has deemed clean, let no man deem unclean. And the church in Acts at the Council of Jerusalem actually wrestled with that as well. They tried to figure out, hey, what can we tell the Gentile church about what is clean and what is unclean? So here, Peter is saying, Jesus here in this text is declaring all foods clean. This is huge because at this time, Leviticus 11 had a long list of things that were kosher, right? We hear that word today with Jewish folks, right? And Mark says that Jesus has now declared all those things in that list, pigs and otherwise unclean animals, clean. This was scandalizing for a Jewish audience who had been observing this law for centuries. Mark says that Jesus, in saying this, declared all foods clean. So what does that mean? What is he getting at? Well, he says what comes out of a person is what defiles him. Again, he repeats things in the text to make sure that people are getting it. Hey, it's not what goes inside of you that defiles you. It's what's coming out of you, right? For from within, out of the heart of man, comes evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. He goes through an entire list. A couple of ones that I think are really interesting that we can look at right quick are sexual immorality, which is the Greek word porneia, right? And where do we get that from? We get the word pornography, right? Our English word. And then the word theft is actually the Greek word klope, and it's from the Greek word klepto. Yes, that sounds familiar, right? Because a kleptomaniac is someone that we know who has an irresistible urge to steal. So we get those two words from Greek words. And then envy literally means having an evil eye, like having an evil eye towards someone else, right? So it's interesting that Marx divides this into 6 overt acts, right? And then 6 attitudes, right? Because these are all attitudes, right? Slander, pride, foolishness, sensuality. And these are all acts, right? So he has this list here that divides it into 2 different categories, but all of those things actually flow out of people's hearts. Even these overt acts are heart issues, right? So he's saying, hey, out of your heart is going to flow things that are going to impact you. And that's what Jesus is trying to get at here, right? So then he says, again, reiterating, all these evil things come from within and they defile a person. Now, this is the second time that Jesus says these words in this passage to add emphasis to it. Why? Well, maybe Jesus knew how hard this teaching was going to be, not for just for them, but for us too. I love what Spurgeon says. He says, all the trouble in the world does not put sin in the Christian, it brings it out. It doesn't put sin in the Christian, it actually brings it out. So there are things in this world that bring stuff out of us. And here's the thing about us, right? We prefer behavior modification over heart change. There's a checklist of behaviors that take precedent over checking our hearts, right? But Jesus says that the pure in heart will see God, not the rule keeping folks, not the people who want to keep rules and want to modify their behavior, right? Because our behavior actually follows our hearts. So the Pharisees had it backwards. They wanted people's hearts to follow their behavior. So in theological terms, this is what we call legalism, right? Valuing right behavior over deeper level heart change. And here's the thing that's encouraging. We aren't the only people with this struggle, right? In fact, we mentioned this earlier in this session where Peter kept a kosher household for years, even after hearing Jesus teach this. He's here listening. But in Acts 10, he's still wrestling with this. Like, I know what you said, but my behavior, I want to be able to modify my behavior to show just how good a Jew I am. I'm not going to eat pork. I'm not going to eat things that are unclean. And he defaulted to right behavior in this instance over having the right heart. Deep down, though, the human heart is sinful and produces everything that we just read about in that list, right? In Mark 7:21 and 22, that list. So that's why I think the cross is necessary. One of the reasons why the cross is necessary. To change the human heart, not human behavior. The cross is the ultimate heart check because Christ did what we couldn't do in keeping the law perfectly so that he could write his law on our hearts, change our hearts in order to change our behavior. And before we think we can get a pass on behaviors, right, we need to look no further than the Beatitudes to see that a transformed heart looks like a transformed heart, right? He says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall see God. He says, you've heard it said that you shouldn't commit adultery, but because you have a transformed heart, I say that whoever looks at a woman lustfully has committed adultery. You've heard it said, don't murder, but I say to you, if you're angry with your brother and sister, you're liable to judgment. So Jesus ups the ante. Why? Because he's transformed our heart, placed his spirit in us in order to guide us in this life where we know that we can't modify our own behavior. But the Spirit of God can check us in these instances when we get upset with a brother or sister, or as a man, when we look at women lustfully, where the Spirit convicts us and shows us that there's a deeper heart level transformation that continues to happen in our hearts. So Jesus' standards actually require more of us. And it's only through a changed heart and the help of his Spirit that we can carry ourselves in a way that honors Christ and honors his gospel. That's what Jesus is getting at in this text. It's not about washing hands. It's not about food regulations. No, it's about the heart and what comes out of the heart that defiles someone. So today I'm doing a heart check. Today I want to challenge you to do a heart check to make sure that we're in step with God's Spirit. All right, folks, that's been session number 25. Enjoyed it. Looking forward to the next session with you all. Grace and peace.